So welcome to part 6 of Exploring the World of Open Education, work that doesn't go into the trash. We're going to talk today a little bit about the concept of renewable assignments, the topic of open pedagogy, which has been addressed in a number of different ways already at this conference. In fact, just today, we have like 2 or 3 things about open pedagogy, and going all the way back to our keynote speaker on the 29th of January, Jasmine Roberts, we've seen that we can potentially address or approach open pedagogy from a number of different perspectives, whether it goes back to educational theory coming from people like Bell Hooks, or whether it is more recent kind of licensing specific approaches that we'll be discussing in this specific workshop. So that is kind of the focus of this workshop here, is to think about open pedagogy and kind of think about what that term actually means and how the licensing component of open educational resources is actually significant to a definition of open pedagogy. But at the same time, it's still a relatively recent, the discipline of open education has developed and formalized in a sense over the last decade. And there are still a lot of questions, I think, a lot of discussion to be had about trying to figure out where this work really belongs in the scholarship. So what I'm going to do today is, after a couple of logistical things and general introduction, I'm going to go into trying to talk about some definitions of open pedagogy, show you a couple examples. Not that you haven't seen those, because if you've been participating in this conference, you've probably seen several already, but I'll show you these anyway. And then I will share a research study that I did in my English composition course with you. And after that, we hopefully will have some time for some discussion at the end. So please, as we're going through this whole thing, think about what do you think is the greatest potential for this kind of approach to teaching and learning, but then also, what do you think are some of the challenges or some of the things that might make you a little bit reluctant to engage in it or to try it out, because it can be intimidating, to say the least. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. So this is for Maricopa faculty specifically. If you are a residential faculty and you are eligible for FPG, Faculty Professional Growth, then just make sure that you stick around for the whole thing, and you don't have to sign in and out because we track the attendance in WebEx. There is an evaluation and assessment form on the conference website, and it's also linked on the last slide here. And then you can see that you also have to fill out that form, and then make sure to submit that within 90 days to your college rep. Okay, so moving on to the stuff that I think is more interesting. One thing I always like to do with these is kind of share this idea of recommended reading that complement the workshop series that we've designed at Open Maricopa. The first here is a collection of essays that kind of approach open education from a variety of disciplines. So I recommend that as a complimentary reading. So of course, both these are openly licensed, so you can find them for free online and read them. The second one is an article that was published a couple of years ago that proposed a framework by which we can kind of gauge whether or not our kind of interaction in the space of open education with resources and with creators is considered ethical and appropriate stewardship of those resources. So I do recommend both these readings because I think that they help to kind of approach open education from a variety of perspectives. And one other thing that's not on here is, of course, the Creative Commons certificate materials. If you would like to learn more about open education, but specifically about Creative Commons and licensing, just Google Creative Commons certificate, and you'll find that you can enroll in their course, but you can also just access their learning materials for free because they're all licensed CC BY. So you can actually kind of go through and get a lot from that. And I found that course to be a great experience. So a couple of plugs there. And then I also like to remind people as well that open educational resources, or open education, is about saving students money in a sense, and saving students money is a very important thing. But as we've heard from a number of speakers throughout the conference, and you've probably heard otherwise, open education is not just about saving students money, as important as that is. It really is about a whole suite of values that can have the potential to really transform the way that we approach learning and the way we approach the kind of creation of knowledge and dissemination of knowledge. And so I encourage you to keep that in mind as we move forward. In fact, because it is a requirement for the individual FPG for Maricopa faculty, I do want to do a real quick crash course in OER. So those of you who have gone through this whole series so far, you've probably heard me do these slides like, 6 times now. But what I would like to do is see if I can do it in 30 seconds. So open educational resources is a term that we use to describe any kind of intellectual property that is made available by the copyright holder under a sharing license, like those developed by Creative Commons, or material that's in the public domain, which means nobody controls the copyright. Now, when that material is available like that, it carries with it what we call the 5R permissions. So you have the right, when you are working with an openly licensed material or something in the public domain, you have the right to redistribute, retain, reuse the material, and then also to remix and revise the materials as well. So you can, faculty, this is really supportive of academic freedom. Faculty are able to, update their materials, localize them, globalize them, whatever they want to do. And I would say that, when I say intellectual property, it could be anything as small as an image, anything as large as a textbook or an entire course, or videos and modules and learning objects and all kinds of different things. And then I also like to add too, that the term open educational resources can be misinterpreted just on its own, because it almost implies that the educational part is somehow significant. Like for example, when we're talking about openly licensed material, something that's in the under a Creative Commons license or in the public domain, well, we call those open educational resources just because we happen to be using those things in an educational context or for an educational purpose. But that actually has no impact on the 5Rs and has no impact on the licensing. In fact, if you find material in the public domain or under a Creative Commons license online, as long as you're not working with something, against the license provisions, you could use those for your own personal creative projects. You could use them for commercial purposes, potentially, depending on which Creative Commons license. So it really is, openly licensed materials that we happen to be using in an educational context. And I say that because part of, I guess the segue here is that part of this discussion about open pedagogy really has to do with trying to almost rethink the traditional educational structures that exist. So whether it's the dichotomy between, the institution and non-institution, like where do you learn, right? Do you learn, does knowledge only exist in the institutions, or is there existing knowledge outside the institution? How do we navigate the differences, or should there be differences? Also the roles of teacher and student also can be interrogated to some extent here. And it goes to this idea of free versus open. So when we talk about open educational resources, we're specific, the open part, right, refers to those 5Rs. The fact that it's, you can adapt materials, you can revise materials, you can keep a copy, control the content, that kind of a thing. So free is not necessary. I mean, the materials are free to use and to adapt because of the open licensing. So that's kind of the relationship between those two words. So if we see open educational resources as permitting these things, I mean, that's kind of the standard definition, then, well, why don't we ask ourselves about different ways that we can actually kind of utilize those permissions to make the learning experience different for the students, so that students are not, and again, you don't have to think of yourself as like a practitioner of open pedagogy to agree with this, because this goes back a long way. But the idea is that students aren't just containers that can be filled up with knowledge, right? So this kind of supports that whole idea that, when we are working with open educational resources and we're permitted to do things with those resources that traditional copyrighted materials don't allow, then perhaps there is more engagement and better learning that can be the result. Now, that's the promise, and we'll look into this and try to consider some of the challenges. Here is, actually, I'm going to open this up. This goes back to 2013. It's a blog post by David Wiley, who is an advocate for open going back a couple of decades at least. Also one of the co-founders of Lumen Learning, which is an OER curation and development company that's out there. But he, in this article in 2013, What is Open Pedagogy, tried to kind of like encapsulate this general idea, because what was going on was so much of the focus in open education going back, to going back 15 years, or more, was really about replacing textbooks with open textbooks. And again, there's maybe nothing wrong with that, but the idea was like, okay, this textbook costs $150. This textbook is free online. Print copy costs $20, publisher versus, OpenStax or something. But the question was, is that really like the best that we can do? I mean, we're talking about open content licensing. There's so much potential that might be squandered. And I bring this up because I like this quote right here from his article where he says, using OER the same way we use commercial textbooks misses the point. It's like driving an airplane down the road. So, I mean, the idea is the airplane can do all kinds of stuff, right? It can fly, go really, really fast. And yet, if we don't take advantage of or think creatively about the potential of new technologies and new approaches, we're just basically repeating, we're not really going anywhere, more quickly, I guess, in a sense. And so I like that analogy because it does kind of help to position this. You have to remember that in 2013, the world was different in a lot of different ways, but since in the last 8 years, really, from 2013 to now, the amount of scholarship related to skills mastery and learning outcomes and open pedagogy and OER has increased, I think, quite a bit. And there continues to be more research into that coming out on a regular basis. Back in 2013, open education as a movement or as a nascent discipline was really really more focused on cost savings, general outcomes, as in do students pass or not, things like perception of materials. Those are all really valuable metrics, I think, when we're trying to figure out, educational research. But the question of, well, what is the pedagogical impact of these openly licensed materials was only kind of beginning to really make its way into the open education discussions. And so this is by no means the only article. There were a few other articles published right around the same time that also kind of start to bring this question up of like, well, what is the pedagogical implication of the open licensing? What can we do with that? What's the promise, kind of thing? And so I do encourage you to check that out. In fact, you can see some of that discussion in the research study that I'll be talking about later if you actually go to the study and read the literature review section. Anyway, so this is just David Wiley's take on it, and I think though it is a good starting point for a discussion. So as he says here, it's kind of like his definition at the time, at least in that article of open pedagogy, is very specifically like what you can do with 5R permissions that you can't do with traditional materials. And traditional, obviously, used in a way that might not be totally accurate, but basically the non-OER, right? So if you're using materials that are freely accessible but you can't adapt them, then that's great. And having your students use those materials and adapt those materials is great, but how is it that it's, what makes something open pedagogy, really? Because there are a number of different approaches to pedagogy that involve students creating things. There's nothing new about that. There's nothing new about having students, not just create things, but share them and teach other students with them. We can't call that open pedagogy because that's been around for a while, right? So what is it that we're actually talking about? And that's part of the discussion that I'd like to have. And I do see, Asmita, your questions were the 5Rs again. Just as a reminder, I'll go ahead and go back because it's pretty important for us I can't stress it enough. If I go back to this slide, you can see them on the right there. The 5Rs are the ability to redistribute material, to keep a copy or retain the material, so you're not depending on someone else to manage the content for you, the right to reuse it, and then I should say permission to reuse it, and the permission to remix and revise. Those are the 5Rs. And if a material does not permit those things, then technically we would consider it not to be an open educational resource, although it still could be effective. Anyway, but going back to this point about open pedagogy, so then this brings up this kind of these two concepts of the renewable assignment and the disposable assignment. So, and there's going to be a chart a little bit later here that I'll show you to kind of compare some other pedagogical approaches. Because some of this stuff, again, I know some people see this, they're like, well, that sounds like, constructive pedagogy. That sounds like an authentic assessment. And you're right, there's a lot of very similar things going on here. Typically, though, when we talk about a renewable assignment, we're specifically talking about projects or learning objects or artifacts that are created by students that actually have some sort of value outside the classroom. They have value outside of the classroom and to other learners, and they are also that value is able to kind of continue on because people in the future, by way of the licensing, are permitted to mix and revise those materials as well. Contrast that to the typical disposable assignment, right? The disposable assignment, I mean, the worst example of it, and this is coming from an English professor, so don't worry. I mean, I'm not trying to insult anybody here, because I am very guilty of this as well. And I don't even know if I'd say guilty. It's just that it's a different kind of thing that we're talking about. But the typical disposable assignment is like write an essay, or like write like paragraphs about your knowledge to demonstrate your knowledge. Well, it's like choosing a form that everybody is already, kids now, I mean, they learn the 5-paragraph essay in K-12, supposedly. It should, right? And by the time they get to college, then we're trying to kind of move beyond that, but they already have usually that as a baseline. And yet, what is the actual real world value of a 5-paragraph essay? All right, I'm going to get into that later. I know that might trigger some people, but like I said, I mean, that's just coming from an English professor and somebody who actually teaches essay writing as part of the course. So the question is, what is the value that essay, the student puts all that work into, and then you, the instructor, take all that time to grade? What's the purpose of it after that? I mean, it serves potentially as, not potentially, but I think that the disposable assignment, generally speaking, no matter what it is exactly, has proven over the years to be effective in communicating a student's level of mastery. But again, it's not necessarily something that has any value to anyone. And that's kind of sad. It's like squandering potential opportunity. So when we talk about renewable assignments, I think typically what we're talking about is an assignment that is directly engaging students in creating materials that are public and in empowering their voice in a way that kind of like the traditional approach maybe does not empower. So with open pedagogy, what you're doing is you're saying, well, students are capable of co-creation. Not that we're all at the same level, certainly not. Not that a student and someone who's in a first-year composition class has the same level of rhetorical and composition knowledge that somebody with a master's degree or a PhD in English has. But certainly, what open pedagogy allows and encourages really is students to think about the act of creation as something that is part of a global effort to bring knowledge or to grow knowledge and bring knowledge and make it available to the world. So students can actually be part of that process as well, rather than just being the recipients of the knowledge. Again, they're part of the process of creating it. And in going through that process, again, theoretically, going through that process, they would hopefully actually gain greater skills because they would be doing higher order tasks according to Bloom's taxonomy. And I'll talk about that actually this next slide, right? So the idea is that, a lot of times with, not always, but open pedagogy and renewable assignments often do force students to, well, certainly create something, right? Rather than just like creating an essay. I mean, you're not really choosing the form when you tell a student, okay, well, you have to write in 3 paragraphs, the history of, the years leading up to World War II or something like that. That could be a great way to learn whether or not the student has a basic understanding or what level of understanding they have. But if you start to think about like, well, so what is the real world application for this, or what is a way in which this knowledge can be, formulated in part by the student so that it's shared with the rest of the world and contributes to knowledge, then you're talking about creating artifacts that actually have a purpose outside of the classroom. And that's going to probably involve like higher order thinking, right? I mean, it's going to involve more complicated tasks. And again, not all students are going to be prepared for this necessarily, but it's worth, I think, considering. So I've said a whole lot so far, and let's see, it's only been about 20 minutes. So I'm going to just go ahead I'll just continue here, and then I got a couple of examples. And again, if you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I wanted to share this chart with you. This is actually directly from a relatively recent article about what's called the term OER-enabled pedagogy, which is suggested by David Wiley, who I already mentioned, and John Hilton from BYU. And so I'm just sharing this with you because, this is not necessarily like established in the discipline. This isn't like factual. This is more like a proposed framework for understanding the difference between, what does it mean to be open pedagogy versus something that is a constructionist assignment or something that is an authentic assignment. So basically what they've proposed, first of all, rather than calling it open pedagogy, they've proposed a term OER-enabled pedagogy to indicate the central or the centrality of the OER, right? So you can do an authentic assignment with your students wherein, there's actual value that the artifact creates beyond just the students learning. You can do that without using OER. You could also have a public thing, like when you have students make a video and that video goes online and is shared with others and people can go check it out and other people can learn from it. So in some sense, like the way that we hear the term open pedagogy used, sometimes it's almost as if that term includes authentic assignments and constructionist assignments as well. But just for the sake of, just the sake of scholarship and trying to make sure that we have definitions and we have a discussion about what these words actually mean, the proposition here is that a renewable assignment, right, something that is enabled by OER, or in some ways thinking about it as open pedagogy, right? A renewable assignment is an assignment that is openly licensed and public and also has value beyond that. And the reason why this is significant is because of the fact that, again, it has to do with that the OER, the open licensing, the question of like, well, what's different about that? And what's the potential from that? So I think that this is helpful, not necessarily to say like, this is how it is, but to say like, this is a good framework that we can use to kind of like distinguish between certain things. If I ask my students to write an essay, rhetorical, you're going to hear a lot about rhetorical analysis in a minute here. If I ask my students to write a rhetorical analysis essay, I would consider that a disposable assignment because they're going to write it, they're going to work on it, I'm going to grade it, and then it's going to get thrown in the trash. I mean, no one's going to look at it again. It's not like they're going to, necessarily have, it's very, very, very rare that a student is going to take that rhetorical analysis essay and include it in anything other than maybe a portfolio at the end of the semester. Potentially, maybe a writing sample to get into a future institution, but other than that, there's not really a lot of added value to it. However, there are different ways that we could potentially explore having students demonstrate their skills mastery, even learn about certain topics in the process of actually creating something with that value that can then be used by others. So, and if you want these slides, by the way, you can find all the slides in that OER workshop series I mentioned at the beginning. And if you just email me, I'm happy to send you that URL again. But I did want to also, I'm not going to read through all this stuff, but I would say, like, if you want, according to Wiley and Hilton, if you want to know like whether or not what you're doing is OER-enabled pedagogy or open pedagogy, then you would ask these 4 questions right here. And again, this is somewhat controversial because this is just a suggestion in the scholarship, and I think that there is definitely it's worthy of a lot of debate, actually, to try to figure out, well, does it really matter if it's public? Can't we still call it open pedagogy if you're talking about having students create test banks, questions for test banks, but you don't want to make test bank questions public because of the fact that they're supposed to be, rigorous assessment tools. So, but it's still open pedagogy because students are helping to create the materials, right? So there's these kinds of like slightly different interpretations about what it means. And not to say that we're necessarily going to go down that rabbit hole for the rest of this session here, but I did want to make sure that this is kind of grounded in that debate. Okay, let's talk about a couple examples. You've seen probably some of this stuff, but I think one of the earliest examples of open pedagogy, probably still one of the more common ones that you see, is is students as designers and co-creators of websites, specifically like wiki courses. You could even have, now this is not obviously public Wikipedia, but there are many faculty across the world who actually have students do, like, their assignments actually involve students editing Wikipedia pages. So if you think about it, that is a great example. I don't think anybody could argue that's not open pedagogy or OER-enabled pedagogy, because Wikipedia is an openly licensed material, it's public, and if students are involved in, and a process, of course, is involved. You don't want to just encourage students to go edit a Wikipedia page, haphazardly. I think with the right kind of scaffolding, then the instructor in this situation is really some more of the instructor is kind of like the gatekeeper in a sense, rather than the publisher editors being the gatekeeper of knowledge. It's the individual instructor and that group of students. If you have certain students whose work is kind of like really exceptional, then you might decide that that's what gets published while the others don't, or you can leave it more open than that. It's kind of up to you. But anyway, point being, you could do public Wikipedia, but this is an example of a university wiki. So this is something that you could actually potentially do at any institution you have. But you could do this in Canvas, or using a Google site, or using any number of other website builders, basically. But what this is if you look down here, you'll see that it may, I don't think this is, let's see, oh, it looks like 2020 summer online, so they are still using this course. You can see though that this goes all the way back to 2010. It looks like it was a set of poster projects that students had created to cover certain topics in fitness and nutrition, human nutrition. And over the course of actually a decade, it developed into a complete wiki course online. So the authors of this course, from what I understand, are in some part instructors, but largely also students. So a lot of student work went into developing these materials, and it was kind of built upon semester after semester. So that's one example, and that's just a wiki. The other one here, and I believe that Jasmine Roberts referenced this, or maybe it was Shinta Hernandez last week, I can't remember, maybe both. But this is a really famous example of an open pedagogy project using Pressbooks. So, but you could do this with any kind of open publishing tool, really. It doesn't have to be Pressbooks. The point is that Robin DeRosso is faculty teaching literature courses, and one of the things that she did here was she decided, all the students are reading early American literature, like all of the works, the primary sources that you would use in an early American literature course are in the public domain, because they're all, we're talking about, everything from, the before the European settlers, everything from before that to probably like, mid 19th century or something like that. I mean, depending on how exactly it's split up. The point is, though, no one owns the intellectual property for most of those materials, right? Unless it's like a translation or there's something unique. For the most part, it's all public domain. And yet the anthologies are really expensive. I mean, somebody buys one of those real thick anthologies and it's like, $150 or potentially more. And so anyway, she was thinking, I don't need this textbook. This stuff's all on Project Gutenberg or in Wikisource or other, places online. What is it that we're missing? Well, if you think about it, what you're paying for when you get an anthology printed, printed textbook and like that, is not the primary sources, which are the core of the readings, but it's all the ancillary materials, the author bios, historical contexts, critical reception, study questions, glossary, all those kinds of things, right? That stuff is copyrighted. That stuff's not in the public domain. So she thought, all right, well, let's just have the students make those materials, right? They can demonstrate their knowledge by reading the primary sources, and then their projects will be projects involved in actually developing those materials. And if you look in here, that's exactly what you end up with. You end up with the articles in here are basically written by students in her class, sometimes collaboratively and sometimes individually. And so now their work basically has what's produced is not an essay that just like, again, goes in the trash at the end of the semester, but it's a published material. The students are now published as part of this academic project, and future users can go back, take these materials, and use them in their own classes, adapt them, involve future groups of students on the same kinds of things. And over the years, these kinds of materials can also be improved by that process as well. So it's kind of like almost like a sense, it's like crowdsourcing the improvement of these materials. And some people I've heard people say, this is kind of a side note, but I've heard some people criticize OER saying like, well, there's no peer review process. Well, first of all, that's not always true. I mean, there's a lot of OER that's created with a very rigorous peer review process. But it is true, though, that a lot of materials that are openly licensed and are shared like this publicly are developed by individuals or developed by the community. And just like Wikipedia, there are flaws to that process, but over time and with attention, especially the crowdsourcing of that peer review can, not necessarily is guaranteed to, but can be as effective, if not more effective, than whatever kind of peer review process you might have put into another material. But anyway, the point being though that this is just one example. Again, this is the idea of like an ebook or a course textbook, an open textbook that students are contributing to. And again, if you have a Pressbooks account, you can literally, and you're like, hey, I really want to use this in my book, or if you want to just put this in Canvas, you're permitted to do so because of the license, right? So anyway, one other one, and this is something actually, this is an assignment that David Wiley himself, I learned from him, or this is an example actually. I'll go ahead and play this. I think I had trouble before. Let me see if you can get the audio. Do y'all hear the audio? Let me know in the chat if you do. All right, someone says I can't hear the audio. So I should have figured this out before I got in here. I think I can change. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to just go ahead and move on. So I'll just explain what it is. You can see here that this is the famous presidential debate between Nixon and Kennedy. Now, what this assignment requires students to do is you give them a prompt of some sort. You give them an argument or an issue that they're supposed to address, and you ask them to go find public domain video. And then what they are required to do is compose a script to be dubbed over that video that will represent in some way the issue or debate that you were supposed to address. So in this case here, I don't know the exact assignment prompt, but I would imagine this was in a graduate level media studies course. And so the issue that they were trying to address was, what is better for the future of, digital communication over the internet, blogs or wikis, right? And so in this case here, what you have is this group of students got, they had, you can go out and find all kinds of public domain video on the internet. This obviously is an old presidential debate, but you can find old public service announcements and all kinds of other videos out there, old stuff typically. It's kind of a fun and creative assignment because what you can't hear the audio, but I do encourage you to check this out. But the link is in there because what it is that you've got the two folks that you've got Kennedy and Nixon, and one of them represents blogs and the other represents wikis, and they're basically, instead of having a presidential debate, they're voiced over and they're debating about which one is better for the future of the internet, whether it's blogs or wikis. And it's actually a pretty funny, I mean, in a nerdy way, but it's a kind of a fun way for students to do this. And you can see that there's 60,000 views. Some of those views might be just me and David Wiley and others who know about this example talking about it, but nonetheless, this is again something that lives on the internet and that others can use for their own education and potentially even adapt based on licensing. So this is just another kind of example of an open-ended assignment. Now, these are only just 3 different examples that I just happened to, think, like, okay, let's like try to show a variety here. One of the things, let me see if I can get my tab back. So what specifically I did, so let me see if I, first of all, sorry about the audio. I'm gonna have to learn how to do that better. But one thing that when we think about these renewable sciences, we think about open pedagogy, generally speaking, there's so many different things that might potentially like fall into that category, depending on who you're talking to. And what my approach specifically, when I did a research study a few years back, was thinking about in first year composition courses, because that's my, mainly what I teach is like the first or second semester composition courses. And the questions that I had were, well, if I were to replace, one or more of these disposable assignments with something open, would that, like, first of all, is that going to have any impact on whether or not the students are learning some of the, course materials, some of that content? And then the other question was, is that actually going to hurt them when they have to write an essay? So because that's, if you think about it, like this next one is here, it's like the preconception that a lot of people have about English composition courses is that it's all about training people how to write an essay so that they can do good in school. And I, first of all, think that is like a terribly limiting way to think about it. In fact, it's totally inaccurate because rhetoric and composition go far beyond the institutional boundaries, and essays are, just let's be honest, they're kind of a dying form. I mean, as much as we might want to advocate for long form writing, I'm still a huge fan of it, but at the same time, it's not necessarily like the core of what we're trying to teach people. In fact, if we're teaching people about rhetorical terms, teaching people how to do rhetorical analysis, what are the tips for the process of composition, that stuff can be applied in a lot of different contexts, not just in essay writing. But nonetheless, the question is, if you actually redirect the attention of the course from something that has been working okay, and in my case, one of the essays that I had my students write in first year composition was a rhetorical analysis essay. They would, they would pick a commercial or they would pick a political speech, and then they would write an essay and talk about ethos, pathos, and logos, and talk about, the relationship between form and content and what the purpose is and how they're appealing to the audience and all those different rhetorical things. And I apologize, it gets a little bit wonky with the rhetorical analysis stuff, but it's just that's part of this research study. So the point is that that's a concern. Like, if you're redirecting some of the content of the course away from long form essay writing, and yet they all still have an essay they have to write at the end of the semester, is the group of students that does the open pedagogy assignments in the meantime going to do worse than those who have the extra practice doing the disposable essay assignments? So that was basically the idea behind this research study. And this here, I know it's kind of small, but I'm not going to go through this entire thing, but I had an even more open-ended open pedagogy assignment than the 3 that I showed you before, right? Because the 3 that I showed you before had a very specific form in mind. I apologize, I should have muted my phone. They had a very specific form in mind, right? There's a wiki, and basically the wiki is, this is the wiki, this is the form of the thing that you're going to make. Now students go do research and draft content to put into the wiki. Same thing with the open textbook. The idea is, this is an ebook, it's a textbook. You all have to create author bios and historical context and blah, blah, blah. Go do it and then fill out the textbook. And the video is a little bit more open-ended as well, right? So the video was like, well, you have to create but it was still, you have to create a video. My open assignment that I decided to test out doing in this classroom study was completely open-ended. I mean, it had to be, what they had to do was identify a rhetorical situation that's relevant to their professional lives or their personal lives or whatever. And I won't go into too much detail again with the rhetorical stuff, but they had to figure out, like, okay, how do these concepts actually apply in my life? And then they had to design a learning tool that would be appropriate in educating people in that profession about how rhetoric applies. And so it was not just, here's a form, fill it up with your knowledge, and then thank you, we have the stuff in this form, but it doesn't really serve a purpose, so we'll just throw in the trash. It's more like, demonstrate your knowledge by creating something that is real and that other people in the future, specifically in that discipline, can learn from and potentially use and revise in the future. Now, this is a very ambitious project, and everyone I shared this with was like, man, your students must hate you because you're so much harder than it, because it is much easier. As taxing as it is for some people to write 5-paragraph or multi-paragraph essays, long-form essays, nonetheless, many students, since they've been exposed to it, there's at least a comfort level with that. Whereas if you have an open-ended assignment like this, then some students just get locked up immediately and they're like, oh, I don't even know what to do. And I will tell you, I mean, I'm happy to answer if you want to know about some specifics. I'm happy to let you know about, some of the responses to this assignment specifically. I would say one student, for example, I remember, this was back before COVID. This was 2016. So I remember we were in a computing classroom for, some like a work session, basically, where students were just kind of doing their projects, and I was going around helping them kind of brainstorm and troubleshoot things. And I went over, and there was this one student who was sitting in front of the computer just staring at a Microsoft Word document, blank Microsoft Word document. And I was like, oh, you're just going to put some notes together? And she looked up at me, she was like, can't I just write an essay? So that was part of the learning curve, was not just for the students thinking like, oh my gosh, like I'm supposed to, this assignment is not just asking me to like regurgitate knowledge, but it's asking me to make a meaningful contribution, or at least make something that could be a meaningful contribution to public knowledge. And so it's a lot more complicated and potentially more difficult. However, some students find it a lot more engaging as a result. So if you're interested in looking into the details of this stuff, I encourage you to go check out this. Again, you can see that this is openly licensed. You can actually find this assignment in Canvas Commons as well. If you use Canvas, you can just go to Canvas Commons and type rhetorical analysis open learning tool. It should come right up. You can download it there as well. But that's not really the point here. The point is just to kind of show you what this was. This was one component of the treatment in the research study that I did. And moving forward, just to give you a sense of what the results were. Well, first of all, it was really messy. It was a very messy process. I've come to understand that pretty much all education research is messy, but at the same time, this was particularly challenging, not just because of the way that, not just because of some of my failures as someone with a background in literature trying to do, data-driven classroom research. It was a new experience. But it was not just messy for those reasons. It was also messy because, and I'm kind of paraphrasing David Wiley here, when you open up your assignments, like, you don't know what to expect. You could potentially get all kinds of stuff. So, I mean, I'm not trying to pretend like this is a really, fantastic, flawless concept. In fact, it needs more attention. But what I did discover was that, students doing these open assignments are able to showcase their skills. They're able to utilize creative talents that they already possess and apply those to these kind of new concepts, right? Whatever the class is. So a lot of the students that we have in first year composition are not necessarily going to be interested in writing, right, or reading. That's just the case. Everybody has to take those classes, and even people who do like writing and reading don't necessarily want to take those classes. But what this does is this says, well, maybe you're really good with graphic design. Maybe you have a lot of video editing skills. I don't know about you, but I know my students definitely do. A lot of them have video editing skills. I mean, kids, 5-6-year-old kids these days, have video editing skills because of the ubiquity of YouTube and that whole culture. And so I think that what this does is this gives students the opportunity to think about how those skills, those talents they have, can actually be showcased in context with something real, right? In a real context, but also applying this knowledge that they're learning in the discipline. And the results of the assignment were basically that there was no negative impact on the final writing task. So at least there was no harm done. They didn't actually master the skills to a greater extent. But they did have the opportunity. Now, this was tough to grade because I was grading it very meticulously for research purposes. Like I had there was a methodology to it so that I could like kind of code the projects that they had. But since that experience, when I have done these open assignments, I found the grading to be outside of the context of doing the research, I found the grading to be much easier and actually not as time consuming. And it's so much fun because students create such interesting things. However, sometimes stuff is just not gradable and you kind of have to follow up with the students and ask them to provide additional clarification. Like, for example, when someone, uploaded a sketch to Canvas and I was like, oh, I don't even know how to grade this. So I had to kind of like look at it and then write a message. Can you write a couple paragraphs to explain to me what in this sketch is supposed to reflect the rhetorical skills that you were supposed to address? And usually that's sufficient because that's just like a communication between the student and the instructor to help to kind of, it's like an artist statement kind of a thing. So that was actually one thing that was helpful as well. Now, what I want to do now is we've got plenty of time, and so I'm excited about this opportunity. I actually would like to open this up to just a general discussion. There's not a whole lot of us here. There's only about maybe 8-10 people here at the most. So feel free to turn on your audio. What I'd like to hear are feel free to ask any questions you want or make comments, but I'd just like to have a discussion about this, like maybe starting off with concerns. With these kinds of assignments, what do you think are, some of the major concerns you might have? And if you want, go ahead and take a look at these questions that are here on the screen and see if any of these questions, if you have a response to any of these, or if any of these seem especially interesting to you. And then again, either let me know in the chat or turn on your audio. So let's go ahead and why don't we start just by looking at that first question there. I'd love to hear from those of you in the audience. So one of the things that this kind of an assignment does involve is releasing work under an open license. So what do you think about that first question? And there's no right or wrong answer. This is not an assessment. These are discussion questions. So what do you think? Should instructors compel students to release work under an open license?
I think they should have an option.
You want to go ahead and explain maybe a little bit more detail what you mean by that?
So students are accustomed to traditional kinds of classes, and as you add new projects, maybe begin with here's one option versus another. So you may write a full research paper, or you may develop this special project under an open license. But the issue is, if students are unaccustomed to open assignments, there should be a way to kind of ease them into them. Because it's a new way of thinking for a lot of our traditional and older students, and even some of our dual enrolled students.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone else feel that way? I mean, I agree completely with that. I mean, I think that, really the idea of, so we have to be really careful. So here's the thing that with my assignment, the students were, if they wanted to, they could just write an essay. It was open. I mean, it literally said you make whatever you want. But there were, in the rubric, there were requirements. And one of the requirements was that the form that they choose has to be appropriate to the audience that they've identified. And if the audience they've identified is, as one of my students was a hairdresser, and was trying to figure out a way to explain how rhetoric could be applied in the situation where you have the hairdresser, working with a customer. And it might not seem like a big, high stakes rhetorical situation, but nonetheless, it's a rhetorical situation. And sometimes there's sales going on there. There's certainly, relationship building and things like that a lot of times happen in the salon. So anyway, the point is as I, she was expected to create something, and she wanted to make a PowerPoint. And most of our students, like you said, kind of when we use that word traditional, a lot of students coming out of high school, maybe this is changing now, but a lot of the students that I've seen they're ready to write an essay, more or less. Not to say that it's exceptional, but they've been exposed. They're used to writing paragraphs. They're used to writing 5-paragraph essays, and they're used to making PowerPoints. PowerPoints is kind of like the backup. And what I did in this assignment, when I was talking to her about it, she was like, "Well, I'll make a PowerPoint." And I was like, "Well, who's your audience going to be?" And she said, "Well, other hairdressers." And I was like, "Well, what real world scenario can you imagine yourself in where you are presenting a PowerPoint to other hairdressers about rhetoric like that? What kind of, is that realistic, And so ultimately it was kind of like, she realized that a better object, like a better thing to kind of create, would be a poster of some sort, maybe, or like even like an infographic, something that could be like put up in the break room at the salon, so that the other people working at the salon would be able to kind of look at it and see kind of some tips about like how to interact with your customers in an effective way or whatever. And so I guess getting back to what you were saying, like for this assignment, if a student chose to write an essay, then they would lose points on the assignment because it was just fundamentally not fulfilling one of the requirements, which is that they choose a form that's appropriate. However, I totally agree, though, that kind of you have to scaffold the experience, because if you just throw them into the deep end on something like this, it's going to be hugely intimidating. So it's almost like piecing it out step by step seems like a really important task. And I haven't necessarily perfected that, but I will say that it is definitely something that's potentially intimidating. But I'm just wondering if anyone has, when it comes to that first question, the key also there I'm trying to get at is, what do you think? Should you force your students to publish, or should you leave it up to them to decide whether or not to publish?
So, may I have a question on that? Actually, when you asked that first question, I kind of traced back to that chart that you showed for the OER enabled pedagogy. And in that, I don't see much difference between that constructionist and renewable, other than just that licensing part. So that would be my first question, is to clarify what is the real difference. I mean, from the student's point of view, they are doing the same things in both of them, except the last column, which is licensing. And does that really matter from the student's perspective in terms of their understanding of the subject or their growing and learning? I mean, why would we not just give them a constructionistic assignment rather? So I guess that's where, if I get the answer to that, then probably it becomes easier to answer that first question here, whether we should compel. I mean, what is it in there for the students between those two types of assignments? I guess that's where I'm kind of thinking.
That's a great question. And actually, there's a research study that I'm working on right now that is trying to figure out, and there are some other research that's been published along these lines as well. Is like, is there a difference between how faculty perceive these things and how students perceive them? Is that, like, when we talk about open pedagogy and open licensing, permitting adaptation and retention of materials and stuff like that, like, to what extent do students actually even identify with those things? Because as Mina, when it comes down to it, like, I totally agree with what you're saying. It's a really, really good question. Like, does it really matter to the individual student? And that's a question that really is up for debate still. I mean, there's not really an answer to that, like a factual answer. But I would say that when you do talk to students about open licensing, and you frame it in a way that is relevant to the course materials, and maybe that's easier for me than it is for other people in other disciplines, because part of what we teach in composition is, how to basically how to reproduce the ideas of others, right? I mean, like when you're paraphrasing, summarizing, quoting, citing, it's a very similar kind of thing to remixing, reusing, and attributing openly licensed materials. Now they're different, slightly different types of things and have different purposes, but nonetheless, like I can easily contextualize it. But one of the things that I would say is that students do, especially now, I mean, I shouldn't say especially now, I think that it's been years and years that students have valued the freedom of information on the internet, right? How like just you can find stuff online. What a lot of students don't necessarily recognize is how valuable knowledge about intellectual property can be to them as individuals in their professional careers. Because, you know, for me, for example, it was like as someone pursuing a creative end as an author or as a professional end as an educator, I found these licenses to be very empowering because I'm able to remix and adapt materials and do so without risk of lawsuit or whatever. I'm doing it legally and ethically. The students get that too, because students are living in a world, actually right now, a lot of students are actually really aware of copyright because there's a lot of big debates on YouTube about what's appropriate use of other people's content and what's not. I mean, students these days know all about copyright strikes. That's like what's called on YouTube. If you have a YouTube video that misuses someone else's intellectual property, you get a copyright strike. And if you get like a certain number, I think maybe 3 copyright strikes or whatever, you're out and you can be demonetized. And this is a big deal, especially because a lot of students, a lot of young people especially, are really, really into this kind of video logging culture. Which me just saying video logging culture makes me seem like an artifact. But like the point is that's kind of like what it is. So I would say on the one hand, let's not presume, I'm not saying that you are, but let's just, I think that we have to be careful not to presume that students just don't care. Because yes, some students do not care. They're like, what do I have to do to get an A? But some other students, when you start talking to them about licensing, you start saying, well, like, here's the deal. When you open up your restaurant and you're designing your menu, if you go like take somebody's photo from Flickr without checking the licensing and you put it on your menu, you could get sued, or you put it on your website, you can get sued, and it's going to cost you real world money. So it's kind of like in line with preparing students to be, you know, contributing citizens in a world where digital media sharing is ubiquitous. And so, but again, the question as to whether or not there is a greater value to the learning with the open license, I think that is yet to be fully established in the research. So I think it's a really good question. I did want to also say, Andrea said, leave it up to them. And so this gets back to the question, you know, should you tell your students you're gonna create an openly licensed material and then you're gonna publish it? And as a requirement, I personally think that it is unethical, if not like just outright, well, I mean, yeah, that would be the same thing, but yeah, I think it's unethical to force students to publish their work as undergraduates. I think that encouraging them to do it, maybe incentivizing it with extra credit or something along those lines would be fine. And is a really good way to go, because you want to make the case. But you have to remember, they are the owners of their intellectual property. When they, even if it's a disposable assignment, doesn't matter what it is, they're making that material in your class. And you know, to tell them that they have to publish it is, I would say, a violation of their right to decide what they do with their intellectual property. So that said, again, part of it has to do with format as well. I mean, if your assignment is basically like you're gonna like contribute to a class wiki, and that wiki is going to be public and openly licensed, then they might be obligated to participate, but perhaps you can give them the opportunity to have their name not included if they don't want to be involved with it. Or you can also have kind of like 2 different layers where they're graded based on the possibility of the thing being published. Which, this is how I've done it. Is like the rubric says it could be published according, you know, appropriately with attributions and content licensing, but it's not actually published. Like whether or not they publish it is like up to them. So that's kind of how I approach it, but I think that it's very, very important for us to keep that in mind, the potential ethical implications of telling, especially an undergraduate student who's just kind of going through that growth process in a particular discipline. And also we know how the internet works. You know, you put stuff on the internet, lives forever. It's not like it's just going to necessarily just disappear, and it can come back to bite you, right? If you publish something online as an undergraduate or as someone who's really, really new to a particular discipline, and then later on when you've pursued that discipline and maybe grown and there's a high stakes job application or something like that that you're going for, and then a potential employer or somebody else like discovers this thing, yeah, that could be a problem, right? So I would say, but having discussions with your students about the reality of digital information sharing, I think, is vital, because if we don't do that, we are not addressing a critical literacy. So there are some other questions here. I don't know. Oh, it does say, is it ethical to let them publish without getting open license? So I guess I'm not sure that I understand that question. Can you want to maybe articulate that a little bit or explain what you mean, Asmita?
Yeah, I actually just wrote it that, I mean, what I mean to say is that what is the point of that constructionistic assignment? I mean, when someone gives a constructionistic assignment, it means they are doing everything. They are creating, there's, value beyond, and they're making it public, but they just don't have the license for it. So then if it is not ethical to let them publish without getting license, then which faculty would indulge in giving that kind of an assignment?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe that just we need a little bit of, maybe we just have to go back and kind of clarify, kind of what I mean when I say like it would be not really ethical to force your students to publish something. I would say there's actually two parts to that. So forcing your students to publish something is like one thing. And I don't really like the idea of forcing undergraduate students to publish. Giving them the opportunity, I love it. But when you ask somebody to publish something with a Creative Commons license or an open license associated with it, you're not just asking them to publish it, but you're asking them to publish it and then blanket permit the entire world for as long as copyright is associated with that piece of intellectual property. You are giving blanket permission to everyone in the world to adapt, share, redistribute, remix that item. So what you're doing, so again, there's like two different things there, and I'm not going to say factually that one or the other or both are unethical. That's up to individuals to decide for themselves. But I think that it is problematic, to say the least, to force students to publish, to force them to publish. I love the idea of involving them in publishing, but to force them to publish is potentially making them do something that's very uncomfortable and could harm them, whether they're putting a license on it or not. If they don't put a Creative Commons license on the material they publish, by the definitions that I showed in that chart earlier, it would be not a renewable assignment, because the license association, right, the open license, is what makes it renewable. It's renewable because the license permits future users to remix and adapt that material. But you have to remember that when the owner of intellectual property puts a Creative Commons license on their work, and in this case, it would be the student putting a Creative Commons license on their work, they are permitting, that's what the license does, permitting other people in the future to use it in certain ways. So in a sense, the difference is with the constructionist assignment, you are having them publish, and that can be uncomfortable, and that can be problematic for its own reasons, potentially if it's not, thoughtfully executed. But if you are forcing your students to publish renewable assignments with an open license, you're also forcing them to give up some of their reserved copyright, if that makes sense. So that is, I think, the significant difference between those two things. And those are good questions. I mean, this is why it's tricky to navigate. And I might sound convincing. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know. I said that, I think, before. But one thing I would say is that I might sound convincing talking about this stuff right now. But when I first started doing this with students back in 2016, 2017, it was really uncomfortable for me, because I had to figure out the right kind of language to use, the right kind of approach to really contextualize it so the students understood why we were talking about licensing. And I found that doing it in the context of intellectual property, academic integrity, plagiarism, citation, if you do it in that context, then it actually does have an impact on them. Now, one thing I would say, now we still have plenty of time left for discussion, and there are, some best practices on the next slide here that I'll talk about. But one other question here that I really want to see if we can get to is this idea of these assignments being so different. And I believe that was already addressed to some extent, Marcia, when you said earlier, these are very different kinds of things. So what do you think are some, potential ways of approaching this with students to make it seem, first of all, to empower them to actually succeed with these assignments? Or what do you think are some things that we should be keeping in mind in order to minimize the potential that this just like shuts the student down and causes them to fail? Any thoughts on that?
This might sound kind of dumb and really obvious, but I think really clear directions, and maybe if you can provide an example yourself, goes a long way for students.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, it's kind of, the question itself is probably the problem. If the good answers are obvious answers, then the question was bad, right? So no, but that's true. I think that I do have something to say about models, though. With this assignment, I'll just tell you, it depends on how open-ended, you end up being with your renewable assignment. But if you're as, crazy as I am, and you decided you let your students submit anything they want, as long as it meets certain criteria, one of the things that's tricky about that is that whatever models you show them will implicitly limit what they produce. So there's kind of a weird catch-22 there. Like if you don't give them models and you say you can do whatever you want as long as it meets these requirements right here, and you don't give them models, which I did not do and I wouldn't do, but if I did that, then who knows what they would have made, right? They could have made anything. I just list a bunch of, but I gave them models. I gave them 2 models. I said, here's a PowerPoint that a student created, and here is this video that was dubbed over. That's the Blogs versus Wikis video I showed you earlier. Those were just 2 models that I gave them, and then I also gave them a bunch of suggestions. And guess what? Like 50% of the students did a PowerPoint. I mean, and it didn't help them, because just because it's not an essay doesn't mean it's not a disposable assignment. In my opinion, most PowerPoints that are created are disposable assignments. Like, I mean, especially when they're, you have that, if you have that as an assignment in a class. I guess there are contexts where you're going to be, presenting to the class and PowerPoints are appropriate or whatever. But in this situation, most of the time it wasn't. It was like I just explained, like the student, who was going to show PowerPoints at like a hairstylist convention, apparently, or something like that. It was not a realistic application. So that's the only thing I would say about the modeling. If you want to have, I guess, think about what it is you want your students to create. If you want them to have like maximum freedom in designing something, and I'm not even advocating for that, because I will be the first one. I already did tell you, the experience was really messy, but most students got a lot out of it. But it didn't necessarily like drastically improve their skills. They improved about the same as the other students did. And I think that's just because of the OER in the class. I mean, the whole class was, the students in both classes had access to the same course materials. It's just there were 2 assignments that were a little bit different. So that's the only thing I would say, is just keep in mind the tendency that models have for directing students. And if you want them to be creative, but you give them a model, then they might sacrifice some of the unique creativity for adhering to the model. Again, that might be valuable. So I don't know. That's a good point. I think it's always important to provide good models to the student. Okay, I'm gonna go. We might end up like kind of ending a little bit early today, but one thing that I would like to the last kind of, there's a few little points on here. I think that we've pretty much hit all of these main points here, but these are kind of the central takeaways in my mind, of kind of being prepared to, explore open pedagogy in your classroom, right? So first of all, self-publishing is like already happening. Our students are already self-publishing. And if you don't think that's true, just consider, Instagram, Twitter, whatever, that's publishing. It's immediate publishing. And a lot of times there's not even, actually there's quite a bit of thought that can go, not all tweets are thoughtful, but certainly there's quite a bit of crafting that can go into that stuff. So we have to keep in mind that self-publishing is easier than it has ever been in human history, and people are doing it more than they've ever done in human history. And for us to continue teaching the way that we've always been teaching outside of the context of this new thing just does not make any sense, especially because of the fact that, like it says in the second point there, it's vital literacy. Because of the fact that it is so easy to publish, it's basically, we are all, as human beings, obliged to basically understand how intellectual property works, lest we have bad situations happen in terms of whether it's being sued or being disgraced, right? Professional problems, that kind of thing. That's pretty much all I've got. I just wanted to, we've ended like 15 minutes early, which is fine with me, but I am happy to answer any additional questions that you have. I hope that if you did not see Jasmine Roberts' keynote, which was part of this Arizona Regional Conference, it was on January 29th. I would strongly recommend that you go check that out because, well, actually that one and also Shinta Hernandez keynote from last week, because they both addressed open pedagogy. But I really loved how Jasmine Roberts was able to kind of contextualize open education and some of this kind of like co-creation of knowledge in Black feminist theory. And I think that was really interesting and an important context as well. Says, would you care to share so Marcia, intellectual property and licensing guidance to students? Yes. Okay, so you're talking about like the materials that I use to teach students about intellectual property. I'm working on that right now. I have a module that is completed, does not have a Creative Commons license on it yet because I've only been using it for myself, but I'm in the process of working that into materials for English Composition 2, which we are developing right now, a team of us between Scottsdale Community College and Glendale Community College. There's a team of us that are working on developing those materials to be published in the Maricopa Open Digital Press, which is our Pressbooks EDU instance. So Marcia, I would say, I don't know what, I'm sorry, but I don't know what school, what institution you're from, but I'll put my email in the chat here. Any of you who are here, if you're interested, feel free to email me and just let me know that you're interested. Oh, okay, cool. So email me and I'll try to keep you in the loop on that because it'll be published. You'll be able to access those materials in Pressbooks, like on our ModPress site, as soon as they're published. And that should be early June, if not May. So, and in the meantime, if you want something to look at right now, then email me and I will just go ahead and share the module with you, just understanding that it does not have a Creative Commons license on it yet, so you shouldn't like share it publicly, but I'd be happy to let you look at it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Almost want to email it here. All right. Any other questions or okay? So as Mita, as our students use ModPress, licensing is free. I have to ask you to clarify that question. Do you mean doesn't cost them anything to publish it on there? That's correct. Yes. Not it's the Open Maricopa is paying for the site license for everyone in the Maricopa community colleges to use Pressbooks. The way that tool works is that you can create the book. Anyone with an MEID can go to ModPress and start creating books, meaning your students can create books. Not that those books are going to be disseminated and that they're going to be high quality and that we're going to promote them, but they can go in there and start making stuff or adapting books or whatever. They can't change other people's books, but they can make their own. And it's free to do that. They don't have to pay anything. You as instructors, same thing. But when it's published, then everyone in the world also gets to see it. So, you know,
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions? You guys ready for Friday afternoon?
Oh, yes.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop the recording, and thank you very much. And remember, if you're doing this for FPG, don't forget to do the paperwork and all that stuff. And I thank you all for joining us today. And